If I could have everyone's attention, you take a seat. We're about to start the program, but I wanted to introduce the Stow Minutemen with fife and drum. They're here to do some music and give a little history, so we hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Bob Stokes. I'm the current captain of the Stow Minutemen, and I thank you all for coming out. This is a very nice attendance for us. So, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the history. The reenactment unit that we represent actually was recreated by order of the Stow Selectmen in 1965, specifically in anticipation of the 200th anniversary that was coming up for 1975. As almost all of the towns in Middlesex and Essex County did, the towns that were involved in the original Lexington Alarm, as it was called. A lot of those units have not lasted for the 50 years since, but we have been around continuously, and largely our local towns as well. Sudbury, Acton, Concord, even Boxborough still have active reenactment units. The original Stow Minutemen were, the history of the militia was that it was required duty for males between ages 16 and 60, going back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims, because we had no army to protect us. So essentially it was the original National Guard, and everybody had to chip in. It was required service and it was unpaid. Then there's the concept of Minutemen, which we identify as, a little controversially, which was a concept going back into the 17th century as being units that would be prepared to march at a minute's notice, literally, when an emergency arose, that the church bell could ring and you were supposed to drop whatever you were doing if you were out in your field, have your gear with you so that you could drop your plow and your tools and pick up your musket and report to go wherever the emergency was. At the time of the Revolution, we know we had at least 2 companies of militia in town, one under the command of William Whitcomb, another under Jonathan Hapgood, who later became a lieutenant colonel in the Middlesex County, one of the 4th Regiment, I believe, serving in the Revolutionary Army. There's some indication we may have had a 3rd company. There's no proof that we ever had a Minuteman company, but it was not uncommon for towns. The Minuteman concept as a company came out in 1774 when our provincial government had been shut down by the military governor in Boston, General Gage. and they continued to meet illegally. And so they started putting up, essentially operating as a shadow government. And they were the ones who recommended, hey, things are getting a little touchy now. Our militia isn't really prepared to fight professional soldiers. Militia service at the time, although it was mandatory, when we weren't actually in a war, it was like 3 to 6 maybe times a year you got together for a little bit of drilling. Maybe 1 to 2 hours of drilling, and then I suspect maybe 4 or 5 hours or more of drinking. And it was more of a social activity than it was the military one. But when the concept of Minutemen came along, the recommendation was take a quarter to a third of your best men, your youngest, healthiest, most athletic, most patriotic. There was certainly some political filtering going on at the time, and make them into separate units. Have them drill 2 or 3 times a week and start to get to the point of training where they might be able to have a chance against a professional army on the field. So as a result of that, they said these people are going to have to be sacrificing a lot more of their work time than a normal militiaman would, so the province was actually going to pay them for their time as opposed to having it mandatory and voluntary. So a lot of towns, rather than having a separate Minuteman unit, made the judgment that their people were qualified and they were all going to be trained, and so that effectively all of their units were equivalently Minuteman units. Also, we know that one company of men under William Whitcomb, Captain William Whitcomb, who's buried down in the Lower Village Cemetery, you can still see his stone, was the group that marched. And we know that because all the units that did march, since it was at provincial duty outside of the town, they were going to get compensated because most of them followed the Redcoats back towards Boston and then set up a perimeter around Boston to make sure they didn't come out again. And so they camped out there as sort of a barrier, blockade, to keep them in Boston for several days. And they were going to get paid for that time by the province, but they had to submit a claim. So we actually have in the Mass Archives a handwritten inventory signed by Captain Whitcomb of all of the men who marched with him towards Concord on the day of April 19th. So we know the names of the men who marched from Stow, excuse me. There were 81 men in total. Companies at the time were probably more like 30 to 40 men in a company. So our belief is that, in fact, of the 2 or 3 companies that we had in Stow, actual militia companies, men from all of them marched together as one unit under one captain. And that's how we got up to a count of 81 men. A single company would not have been that big, very likely at all. Did they participate in the battle? And tell me if I start to go on too long. Again, unclear. Some stories, traditions say they did. Most say they did not. One of the interesting facts about Stow in the Revolution was part of that provincial Congress that was meeting illegally in the fall of 1774 essentially became rebels at that point when they decided, let's stop sending our taxes to the royal tax collector in Boston and let's send them to our own tax collector. And the tax collector that they appointed was a gentleman named Henry Gardner from Stow. And there's a sign out on the Lower Village Common memorializing where he used to live within Stow. And there is some belief that he was one of the targets of the British marching out on April 19th, and they weren't going to stop at Concord with the supplies, that they were going to continue on to Stow. And that's why Samuel Prescott, who was the man who actually ended up alarming Concord and telling him that the Redcoats were coming, was the person who continued on to Stow specifically to notify Henry Gardner as being a potential target. So the thinking is our troops stayed behind in Stow until they were certain that the Redcoats had stopped in Concord and were going back before they left. So they left thinking they left Concord around 12:30, and we may not have left Stow until probably close to 12 o'clock. However, the notation in the archives say that we were noted by the diligence with which we chased the Redcoats on their way back to Boston. So there was some acknowledgement of this men from Stow in particular. So that's a little bit of our history, and now I'll turn it back to the music.
La Belle Country Days. We're playing a mix of dances, marches, and songs, and other tunes from the colonial era for the most part. I'll mention a couple of them as we go. But next is the Lincolnshire Poacher, Turkish March, and Sisters Jig. Quick trip to Virginia. The next piece is called Brandywine. And then a couple colonial songs, Old Robin Gray and The Flowing Bowl. Have a brief. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of fifes and drums before, but we don't always get to know what fifes actually are. So it is a flute-like instrument, early type of flute, no keys. So for those with music terminology in your brains, we're pretty much stuck with diatonic scales. We don't go a whole lot out of, no jazz flute, no jazz fife anyway, although I've always wanted to try. Normally they have 6 holes for the fingers, but there are other types which are difficult to get here. Other types of fife sometimes have additional holes, so you can get some more notes and get some more fancy music out of it, but on the whole, it was an outdoor instrument, not usually for entertainment as we're doing here with you right now, but I'm sure you'll forgive us. And if not, well, we will leave quickly, I suppose. But the fifes, as well as the drums, were functional instruments for the most part. You could play a fair amount of music, as we're doing today, but you also used them for signals. You are looking at the colonial radio unit right now. So we would have the fifes playing high notes, drums playing their beatings, and so the different types of sound carry in a noisy field pretty well. And even to this day, in just ordinary reenactments, the fife and drum still function that way. If there is an emergency, if there is a change of plan, if something needs to happen and a reenactment battle needs to be stopped, we can still play ceasefire and bring the whole thing to a halt for whatever safety concern might come up. So the fifes and drums were versatile, noisy, and useful. And you don't get a whole lot of musicians with the Minutemen and the militia companies quite so much. This would be an unusually large collection of musicians in general. But when minute companies did get together, the musicians of the various towns and companies would also get together and form what's called a massed music. And that's something that actually we did in the aforementioned, that's something that we did in 2000 for the 225th anniversary of the Revolution. And a lot of different fifers and drummers got together and we performed in various events through that festive year. And the fife and drum tradition also continues to survive in New England especially. And a lot of the times you will find it connected with Civil War era music and as also more recent and modern material. So especially in Connecticut, for whatever reason, it's very much a living tradition that continues organically to this day. So when you talk to a fifer or a drummer, they will typically know quite a few pieces, not just from the colonial era, but also Civil War and 20th century and through to now. There are a bunch of us still writing music for fife and drum. So it's very much a local, living folk tradition. So let's play some more music. Mr. Will's favorite and the nymph. Rose Tree, Girl Left Behind. Rose Tree. There's a lot of songs and they all start, half of them start the same way. Rose Tree. sorry. I forgot how it started, so. Sometimes you might feel like the radio plays the same songs over and over again too often. And one of the stories, which may or may not be true, behind the next piece, Katie Hill and White Cockade specifically, is that, wasn't it White Cockade?
Welcome.
Oh, it was Welcome? Oh, well. Well, there's other, yeah, okay. Well, there are other songs that get played a lot. But sometimes you just hear the same songs a lot. So, White Cockade was played over the bridge. There we go. Thank you. I get the stories mixed up. Katie Hill, White Cockade. Last one in this set before we turn it over to the next speaker is a couple songs, John Barleycorn and Royal Bird. So if you're feeling international, the second one is French.
Just following up on a couple of the comments that Matt had made, in addition to providing field commands with the pipes and the drums, they are also invaluable when we are doing long marches. Because they give us a beat, we can keep marching to it. It's a heck of a lot easier to follow and keep the pace if you're following a beat of drum and music. So it would be typical for each of those smaller companies, 30 to 40 men, to have one fifer and one drummer as part of their unit. That was essentially expected. Often it would be the younger boys who weren't yet eligible to carry muskets who would be the musicians. And then as they got older, they might either continue playing music or move over to carrying a musket instead. Yeah.
Did they become targets?
As they were part of the, there's a theory, in fact, that the British musicians wore what they called reverse colors. If you look at the British uniforms, the uniforms generally were red. That's why they were called red coats. But they had trim, whether it be blue or pea green or yellow. And the trim was how they identified different units within various regiments. So like the 10th Regiment was yellow trim, and the 4th Regiment has blue, and another regiment will have the green, whatever. The musicians reversed the colors so that their basic color was yellow and their trim was red, so that they would be easily distinguished from a distance. And the theory was originally, when I joined, they didn't know a lot of this other stuff, that was to identify them as being non-combatants, if you will, and try and help them not be targets. But then when you find out that they're an essential part of the communications on the field, literally giving commands like advance, move left, retreat, you could interfere with their communication system by taking out their musicians, so it may have made them targets.
Let me throw in real quick. So officers wear these. These are the last pieces of a knight's armor that a person would wear. It identifies as the officer, and the officers were typically the biggest targets on the battlefield.
Especially later when we started bringing riflemen up from the south, who could, kill a turkey at 200 yards, they could aim at an officer from that distance as well, and give them a nice target right in the chest.
So,
That's a lot of the British officers stopped wearing these by the end of the war.
so my name is Craig Scomp. I'm the sergeant armorer in the Stow Minutemen. I'm third in line from the captain, and I'm in charge of weapons and ammunition. So one of the great things about reenacting with the Stow Minutemen, though, is we get to create our own characters. A lot of my ancestry is French, and so my kit today is kind of a nod to the French. They had white uniforms with light blue coats and stuff, so a little nod to my background. I also am carrying a French a musket here. This is 1777 Charleville. There were 3 armories in France, and the Charleville musket was the biggest armory in France at the time. I actually prefer French guns personally because the British were the world's superpower back in the day, and a British soldier could be stationed anywhere. England, Europe, India. The sun never set on the British Empire, right? So a British soldier could be stationed anywhere, and so they standardized their musket design to a Brown Bess, which Bob is holding here. And that's great because you could be a soldier and go anywhere and be able to get parts for it. But the French had a different approach. They did continuous improvements, continuous innovation. And so the French guns were considered a little bit more advanced technology at the time. I particularly like them because they're very easy to take apart. The British guns are not able to take apart because they have these pins that hold the barrel to the stock. But the French guns have these bands, and you can take the bands off and take it all apart, and it's easier for cleaning. And shooting black powder is both dirty and corrosive, and so you're cleaning your guns all the time. And so that's a big deal. There are other little features about the gun that makes it more advanced technology. But back in the day, prior to the North Bridge in Concord, the shot heard around the world, right? What was the shot? The shot was under orders. We fired at British troops for the first time. Okay, so there was a skirmish in Lexington, but at the North Bridge we shot at British troops under orders for the first time. So prior to that shot, we were all British citizens. After the shot, we were all traitors. Okay. Now at that point, at the point where you're a traitor, you've got 2 choices. You can either give up and be hung, or you can continue to fight. But what is it that we were fighting for? We had no idea. This is a year before even the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is April 19, 1775. So these people were fighting, and they didn't even know for what yet. Okay? But we were mostly British soldiers. The guns they would have been carrying at the time would have either been personal guns that people made from parts, whatever parts they could get, or they stole a British gun, or they managed to buy one somewhere, and they were carrying a lot of brown Besses like this one. Later in the war, the French were our allies, and so they shipped us a lot of their older guns, okay, so that they could keep their new ones for their own troops, right? But they shipped us our older ones. After the war was over, actually what happened was the Springfield Armory started outfitting the Continental Army with copies of French guns because they were more advanced technology, right? So the Springfield musket was a copy of the French gun. So this is a French gun, and so what are the three parts to make a gun? So it's not hard, and you all know what it is. Anybody can tell me? Lock, stock, and barrel, right? Three parts to make a gun. And to be a gunsmith, you needed one tool. That's it. So two different types of screwdrivers and a pick here, and you could do everything you needed to do with this gun with that little tool. So not complicated technology. So that you might have heard of a lot of other sayings at the time. If this was not an accurate weapon, that's why you had lines of men that would go line up shoulder to shoulder and fire together. And the command was not aim fire, it was present and fire, okay? Because this was not accurate. So you had a line of men that fired at the same time that created a shotgun blast that would hit something, okay? Now, technically in Massachusetts, we still have primitive arms hunting season. I personally would not go hunting with a gun like this, although I could, but I wouldn't consider it accurate enough to do an ethical kill, right? And so I would use a more modern gun to take down a deer or something like that. So some of the other things that you might have heard is you might fire this gun and it might misfire, right? And that would be where there's powder in the pan. There's a little touch hole here. The spark lights the powder. It goes through the hole, lights the main charge, shoots the ball, right? But sometimes the powder in the pan goes up, but it doesn't shoot the gun. That's a misfire, right? Basically, the gun's still loaded, but it hasn't fired yet, and that's known as a flash in the pan. Flash in the pan, right? This is not an accurate gun, right? So for me to fire it, it's a long shot, right? Right? So there are actually quite a lot of sayings like that around the gun. What else can I tell you? Any questions on anything?
Is that authentic?
These are real guns. It's considered a reproduction today because it wasn't made back in the day. So I bought this gun through a company that buys them from families in India that still make the gun. Now they were descendants of a family that were making the actual guns for the British Empire back in the day, and their descendants are still making these guns. But these are real guns. I've taken this to the range. I've shot and ball at targets with it. Now, obviously, in reenactments, in a parade or in a battle scenario, we're using what's called parade rounds, which is just the powder. So you get a bang, you get some smoke. It's a lot of fun. And in fact, for me personally, I'm also a member of Crane's Artillery, and so I fire cannons too, and that's really fun, right? Yeah, but these are real guns. So yes.
One question: in the skirmish at Lexington,
Yeah.
what do you mean by skirmish? Were there shots fired, but they were not ordered to be fired?
So skirmish is like a small side battle. So the main force might be starting doing an attack, but they might have outliers that are doing like some end runs around or some kind of flanking maneuver or something like that, and then they might be taken out as kind of a side battle, or it would just be a small unit that would be just attacking another small unit. Those are skirmishes. It's not a main battle as such.
1925, for the 50th anniversary, a big feud started up between Concord and Lexington.
That's what I'm getting.
In particular, the Minuteman statue and the shot heard around the world, and Lexington saying, what about us? You know, we had 8 guys killed. There were shots fired, obviously. Part of the question was, that was on the Redcoat side. What happened on the militia side? The captain of the militia in Lexington had given them orders to disperse. So their orders were, leave the field, go back home, get out of the way. 50 years later, when some of the survivors were still around, they said, well, that was the order, but I at least fired a couple of shots before I left. So there may have been some return fire in Lexington, but not under their superiors' orders.
Okay.
It was at Concord when the troops were marching down to the Redcoats at the bridge. The Redcoats fired first, and our commander said, fire, and gave them the command to fire back.
So was the British, they were ordered to fire
Oh,
on the
well, there's
colonists,
debate
or-
about that too. Their commanders afterwards said, oh, our troops got carried away. But some of our people said, I heard them give the command. So,
The official line is they don't know who fired first.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, some people say it was somebody hiding behind a stone wall, not part of the units on the field, and they fired at the Redcoats. But that's what the Redcoats were saying when they reported to their bosses in London.
this is why I subscribe to the notion that the shot heard around the world was at the North Bridge, where we shot at the British under orders, right, as a contemplated thing to do, right? So, you know, so.
So I wondered if the one in Lexington was less organized, you know, like,
Absolutely.
it wasn't like a planned thing.
No, it wasn't
And one
planned on
in
either
Concord
side.
was more calculated by our side, correct?
Well, it wasn't so, because we were reacting. So we were marching down, but I don't get into the history, our positions are getting tired here, but the troops who were on the field over by beyond the bridge saw flames coming up and smoke coming up from downtown. And they were afraid the British were literally setting fire to the town. And that's what got them the energy to get together and march down. And the story among the towns is that the Battle of Lexington was fought in Concord by the troops from Acton. Because the unit that first marched down ahead of the militia was an Acton unit. And the reason, and the Acton commander said, I don't have a man who's afraid to go. That's a famous quote. But that was interpreted to mean all the Concord troops were afraid to go. But in fact, the Acton troops were picked because their captain was a gunsmith. He had actually made bayonets for all of his troops. Most of our units on April 19th did not have bayonets. They were going down to confront troops at the bridge, expecting to perhaps come into a hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets would have been essential, so that's why they went first.
So on that, this is what a bayonet looks like. Okay, so this is, you would attach it to the musket like this. Now what happens is, somebody really excellent could maybe load and fire a musket maybe 4 times a minute. Okay, average is about 3 times a minute. When you have a line of guys facing off in battle, you're going to be loading and firing at the speed of the slowest guy, which is like two times a minute. So in a typical battle, the line of guys would maybe get off 1 or 2 shots before they mount bayonets and charge. Okay, when they charge, essentially what this is now is turned into a spear fighting battle. Okay, and it's the same techniques as the Romans and Greeks for using a spear. Okay, and so most battles were actually decided by spear, not by musket fire. And the British were better at it than we were, so they won more battles. Just a little side note for you. As a requirement of the militia, every man had to carry at least 1 bladed weapon. This would be considered a criteria for that. You could also carry a knife, or officers might carry a sword. So you had to have a bladed weapon as well as the musket.
Which could also be a tomahawk or a hatchet.
Tomahawk or hatchet.
Anything that you could use for hand-to-hand combat. So do you have a question?
I had a question because Isaac Davis was the captain of the Acton Minutemen. Was he the person who actually gave the command to fire?
No, it was a colonel who was marching beside him, the head of the militia in all of Middlesex County, as opposed to a company commander. So he was the one marching down beside the unit. And in fact, Isaac Davis was killed in the first volley. So he was not in a position to give a command anymore at that point.
So we were all militia, right? And then that's like Army. And then there was a subset of the militia, which were the Minutemen. They're like the first responders. They're kind of like SEAL teams or something, right? And that's kind of the
And when
way.
you put multiple companies together, you get into a regiment. And so it was one of the regimental commanders from Middlesex.
And it wasn't until George Washington took over, and then he created the first official army, which is Continental Army. Okay.
Yeah,
I have a question. You said that 80 men or 81 marched from Stow?
correct.
What was the population of Stow at that
I
time?
do not
What was
know.
the population of able-bodied men? And were indentured servants either allowed or encouraged to participate?
As far as I know, indentured servants were, even some slaves could have been marching. You know, we know there were black people participating in the military at the time. But what the population of Stow was, if I knew it, I'd forgotten it.
Be very proud, though, that you're from Stow, because the original plan, we believe, was the British were marching from Boston on a secret mission to search, seize, and destroy munitions in Concord, right? But they were really interested in particular 4 brass cannons, okay? And now we knew that they were coming, and 2 of those brass cannons were taken to Stow, and 2 were plowed into the fields in Concord, right? And we believe that the British were intending to come to Stow next after Concord, but they had resistance at the North Bridge, and they decided to turn around. Okay, and of course Stow had Henry Gardner, who was the mayor. What do you call it? The governor, or what?
No, he was the treasurer.
Treasurer, the tax collector. He was supposed to be collecting the taxes for the British, but he turncoated, and he was saving that money for the Continental Congress. So not only did the British want to come to Stow next for cannons, but they also wanted their tax money back.
Where were the cannons hid?
In Stow, when they had been moved from Concord, they had been originally put in Concord, but then they had been moved one to Stow, one to Worcester, and I think another to Groton.
But where in Stow?
Yeah, do they know?
Well, probably close to Henry Gardner's house.
Where's Henry Gardner's house?
Do you know where the Lower Common is? Down by the Stow Shopping Center?
Oh, yeah,
There's
yeah.
that little triangle lane. On that land is a historical marker, and I believe it indicates his house was just across the other side of Great River from the Lower Common. And Gardner was not the king's treasurer. He was appointed by the provincial government in place of the king's treasurer. And so that was he was never that kind of a turncoat. He was always a patriot resistor as opposed to government toady or whatever you want to call it.
The last comment I'll make is, last comment I'll make though is Phil, right? Phil's hat there, if you look at his hat, would have been more common for musket men. And the reason why is when you come to shoulder, your gun's not hitting the hat on the one side of the head, right? So thanks very much.
And we do have 3 muskets over on the table here. You're welcome to come up and look at and even hold if you want to know how much they weigh.
Well, we've got another 20 minutes of music, so buckle. No, I'm just kidding. Welcome, Harriet. The next piece was written by a British soldier, as far as we know, in Quebec during the French and Indian War, and it's called Hot Stuff. And it's not as happy as it sounds. British Muse, Chain Cotillion, and Parting Glass. We're almost there. We're almost there. Yes.
Are you able to demonstrate to us how the music could be used on the battlefield to direct right, left, retreat. Do you have those?
Yeah, we only have ceasefire and assembly. Okay. All right, we'll do ceasefire, and then I'll say our farewells. Yeah, that's kind of sort of made up. Do you want to start ceasefire, or do you want me to?
I wasn't prepared to play ceasefire.
Oh, I thought you said you could. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, well, I said
Right.
I could do prayer mode.
Okay. Ceasefire. And you'll play that for about 5 minutes until everyone stops. So anyway, just on behalf of the Stow Minutemen Company, we just wanted to say thank you, as well as to the Stow Council on Aging.
More of the songs, but it's up to the militia to recognize them. And that doesn't always happen.
So we're going to say thank you with our last song, which is Yankee Doodle, and as well as the Moon and Seven Stars, but not just any old Yankee Doodle. This is Stow's special brew of Yankee Doodle. I don't know any other group that plays it in 6/8 time, so this is your own Stow special treat. Yankee 6/8, 7 stars. You are now permitted to get up and have snacks.
Super.
Roughly 10 pounds. Go feel.
Pretty much like a modern fire.
How you doing? Good. All right, great.